So if you need a VPN, go Nord. Use nordvpn.com/Kimber to get a huge discount off your Nord VPN plan plus 4 additional months for free. It's completely risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. The link is in the show notes. Protect your computer like a cricketer protects its nether region with NordVPN today.
Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 34 of the Footmarks podcast. I'm your host, Behram and Qazi. You can find me at DefMango on Twitter. And with me, as always, is Jarrod Kimber, who you can find absolutely everywhere. And it's worth noting that today's topic is, we're going to be talking about David Warner. So the title is David, the All-Format Goliath. Props to our colleague, Ari, for coming up with that. Nice little biblical touch. But let's start with giving some credit to Shayan, because this is his piece, right?
Yeah, no, he wrote the piece. He really wanted to. I think he's really wanted to start writing some of the bigger pieces and everything else. And he's been talking about Warner a lot, and we've been at the same time he's been writing this piece trying to work out where Warner fits into the top 50 batters of all time. I think he's just out of my list at the moment, and I don't know where he is on Cheyenne's, but we've spent a lot of time talking about Warner. So it was good for me to step away and let Cheyenne read this piece. Hopefully he's read it, but write this piece.
Absolutely. And I mean, we're going to spend even more time talking about David Warner today. And I think he deserves this podcast because of the career he's had. Let's talk about Test cricket first, right? 8,786 runs in 112 tests, averaging 44 and a half. Now he's hung his boots. And this is someone who was pigeonholed as a T20 batter only. And he's ended up as Australia's 5th highest run getter in Test cricket. There's a conversation that Virendra Sehwag has with David Warner in his early IPL days when he's a Delhi Daredevils player, and so is Sehwag. And he hadn't even played, forget Test cricket, he hadn't played first-class cricket back then, right? No better person to have a chat about opening in Test matches than Viru. And he literally disrupted the opening position in Test cricket, much like Viru.
Yeah, I think when he first came in, the thing that I think a lot of people don't remember is just how brutal he was as a limited overs player. Like, he's become kind of a great run accumulator, right? But he wasn't that at all. Like, if you look at that first innings and you watch him facing Dale Steyn, he's flat batting Dale Steyn back over his head for 6th, right? Like, nothing like what we see from David Warner anymore. And he was a cultural moment in Australia. That innings against Dale Steyn was absolutely huge.
Yeah.
And you're talking about an era before Phil Hughes passed, and cricket was more about Test cricket and everything else. And it was probably one of the first big T20 moments. And there was Sean Tate's over, I think, against Pakistan at the MCG was another big one. And obviously some of the things that happened in the Big Bash after that. But Warner was right up there. Then you had the double-sided bat contract that he was given. There was all this talk about how he was getting an IPL contract and he hadn't played first-class cricket. All these things were going on. And we saw the guy who backed away and slogged and, was like a bull in a china shop, so to speak. And Sehwag saw something else. And I don't think many people in Australian cricket did at that point. So incredible that, Virendra Sehwag saw someone like himself. And, you look at the history of cricket, and a lot of teams do have attacking opening options. And I know Australia likes to have at least one player who's going to put pressure back on at the top of the innings if they can find one. And Warner just happened to, fit that bill in a way that Slater and Hayden had before.
And, Haydos was also a left-handed bat. So there's that as well. And Test cricket did suit Warner. He didn't ace it as such, like he's not making your list of top 50 batters, but he definitely, he found his feet at home in particular, and we'll talk about his away stuff as well. But over this period of time when he started Test cricket, he was also forever improving as a limited overs cricketer as well as the years went by. Now, when we think of players who at one point or another have, aced all 3 formats, David Warner's, and this is over a period of over a decade, right? David Warner's name is one of the first few that comes to mind, and he definitely deserves a lot of plaudits for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'd have started my project on the 50 greatest batters 3 or 4 years ago, he definitely would have been in the top 50. And clearly he had a slide. And then also there are parts of his game that we kind of thought he would eventually just overcome, and he never did, right? They stayed with him all the way through. I think you might have asked me today, or maybe it was Cheyenne. Someone did today anyway, whether he was a all-time great or just an Australian great. And I think he's an Australian great rather than an all-time great in Test cricket.
Yeah.
But he certainly had an impact on Test cricket. So I was at the innings when he smashed India. So I think Australia had rolled India at the Wacker for, I don't know, 150, 170 odd. And he came out to bat with Eddie Cowan. And I actually talked to him after that innings. And it's in the documentary. You can see it in Death of a Gentleman. Yeah.
I remember.
And we chatted after, but I remember chatting with Eddie. It was more interesting talking to Eddie Cowan, who was at the other end. So R. Vinay Kumar came on, who I never thought was a test quality batter. Sorry, bowler, I should say.
A royal challenger from Bangalore at best.
Exactly. And I thought he was a decent limited overs bowler at the time, but I couldn't understand why India were thinking he was going to be a test bowler. And he came on, and Warner walked down to Eddie Cowan and said, let's just play him properly, and wait to see what he bowls. Because Warner had faced him before, and I don't think Eddie had. I think that was how I remember the story. Anyway, the first ball that Warner faces from Kumar, it's like a length ball outside off stump, and he slog sweeps it over long on for 6. Right? You don't do the medium paces. You certainly don't do that at the Wacker. You don't do it first ball of a guy that you faced in Test cricket or whatever it was. If it wasn't first ball, it was really early on. And Cowan walks down and goes, why would you do that? and Warner's like, it was in my wheelhouse, mate. And at that stage, that was how he thought about cricket. It was very, very different to the way that everyone else thought about the game. And, he did change his style at times and became a slightly different kind of player. But he never really lost that energy of like, I'm going to do the thing I do, and we're going to see how it goes. So it meant that he was always fascinating to watch, right?
Yeah, and even his celebration has become iconic. They even incorporated that into the farewell Davy thing. I don't know if you saw that at the SCG or not. And even the "Oh, what a player" segment has the Davy Warner celebration, right? So, I mean, he has had a fairy tale sort of ending to Test cricket because he hasn't done too well recently. But then he got Pakistan at home, 3 Test matches, went out on a high, 50 in his final Test innings, and he's hung his boots in ODI cricket as well. Might feature again, we don't know that. But when you look at his resume, right, in terms of trophies, so David Warner has won ICC trophies in all 3 formats. He is a member of an elite club of players who have done this, all Australian, obviously, because New Zealand haven't won a trophy in all 3 formats, and they're the only other team that have won the Test Championship. But he was a pivotal feature in Australia's T20 World Cup win in 2021. He was part of this World Test Championship winning team as well, and he starred in both ODI World Cups that he won in an Australian shirt. That is huge.
Yeah, it's funny. When I was writing about that today, he's kind of invented a club, right? Him and his friends have invented a club that never existed before, and we would never have even thought of. But he's always going to be the first people who've joined that club, and who knows how many will ever join it.
Let's count the people in the club. There's Mitch Marsh, there's Pat Cummins, there is Mitch Stark, Josh Hazlewood, David Warner. Have I missed anyone?
I think that's all 5, isn't it? Is Steve Smith in the club?
Oh yeah, Steve Smith's in the club.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
I don't know. I can't even remember. But either way, the point being is there aren't many of them, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if Mitch Marsh is in it, because I don't think he played the World Test Championship final, did he?
He didn't play the final. He was part of the squad, though. Got a medal out of it.
I don't know if you count that. Anyway, the point being that that on its own is it's a winning record. And while he wasn't always the best player, he had a big part to play in so many of those victories because of the way, we talked about before, him being the disruptor at the top of the order, right? Him being the player who changed your plans. So strike rates don't really matter all that much in Test cricket. And I know we'll come on to that later, but knowing that you have to bowl to David Warner or Virender Sehwag or Matt Hayden or Victor Trumper to start with causes you issues. Right. And it really does. The way that you think about the game changes quite a bit there. So I do think from that perspective, you have to be honest and say that he might not have been the best of that group of players that you've said, but I do think he had a massive impact on the reason that Australia were so winning
Yeah, definitely. And you speak of impact and strike rate. So let's jump right into it, right? He is the second fastest opener in Test cricket in his era. And in all time Test cricket, I believe he's only behind Virendra Sehwag and Tilakaratne Dilshan. And then in limited overs, he was even more explosive because, like you mentioned, test or strike rates in Test cricket, you take them with an ounce of salt or more than that, maybe or less than that actually, if they do really well, if they go Sehwag mode. But yeah, it's a very special trait to have. And he is the sort of player that can change the complexion of a Test match in particular, and even in limited overs cricket. He's just been one of those most impactful players that we've seen in the modern era.
Yeah, I think strike rates in Test cricket, I don't really start to take them seriously till they're 75, 80. Because I think at that point, the scoring rate is really affecting the opposition, right?
Yeah.
And he was in that era. He was in that area. So certainly he has that in his mind. But I think if you do look at the great, some of the great teams, so, when Sehwag was with India and Matt Hayden and even Michael Slater before that, but Gordon Greenidge is the other really big one, right? Their ability to just mess up your plans really, really quickly and put you off balance. And, let's say you've been rolled for 280 and you're like, oh, great. Well, we get a couple of early wickets here. And then suddenly the opposition's like none for 60 after 10 or 15 overs. You're just like, oh God, now we're behind again. And they've already taken a big chunk out of this. That's what Warner did at his best. And, that fast scoring, the aggression, and it wasn't just power. In fact, I would say in Test cricket, I know I told the Vinay Kumar story before, but I don't think it really was just about the power. It was almost like a counterpunch style that he quite often played. But it was also the aggressive running between wickets. You were under pressure in the field, whether you're a bowler or a fielder, the entire time he was out there. So that strike rate did have an impact, especially I think if you're an opening bat. Like your ability, we want to go out and we want to have them 2 down by lunch, and at drinks they're like none for 50 or none for 80, and you're just like, oh God, okay, now what do we do? So I do think those sort of things have a big impact.
Yeah, and it's interesting how in the comparison to Sehwag played all of his cricket pretty much the same way. But Vaughan, as you mentioned, I think punchy is the right way to describe him. And also the fact that he was an absolute live wire in the field and between the wickets. He was just one of those players that would never put, his or take his foot off the pedal. He would be at it against the opposition all the time. And if we speak about averages, Warner has the 3rd best average for a Test opener in his era. He's behind his childhood mate Usman Khwaja and also familiar foe Rohit Sharma. Now his average is 12 more than openers in this period, which is quite impressive considering we've gone through a pace playing pandemic over the last 6 years. Is it now, Jarrod, or 4? It's 4 years. But
I think it's 7 years.
It's 7 years. Well, whenever the wobble ball started troubling batters, but he might not be at Khwaja or Rohit's level, but it's also worth noting that those guys didn't start off as openers. Whereas David Warner has been an opener from the get-go, and you'd have to say in that regard, he fulfilled his role brilliantly, having not had the luxury to develop elsewhere before taking up that opening role.
Yeah, I think it's one thing that we don't factor in all that much, right? Which is if you're Shane Watson might even be a better player to compare him to, right? If you're Shane Watson, you basically become an opener when you are at peak batting age, right? Whereas Warner becomes an opening batter for the Australia in his 10th, 11th first-class game. He's still learning the game, and he's opening for the country. And he wasn't always an opener either, a bit like Sehwag. He was a middle-order player as well, makes a couple of big scores for New South Wales, I think, batting in the middle order. And so, again, you have this sort of weird situation where, what's the best way of putting it? Where the other 2 guys you're talking about become openers when they're at a sort of peak period and then play very, very well, right? And even Matt Hayden, if you compare him to Matt Hayden, Hayden has a much better record, but Matt Hayden didn't have to struggle all the way through his 20s because he kept getting dropped, right? Warner has been there that whole time, right? And learning the craft and dominating the craft at the same time. So it's a really, really... Can you dominate a craft? Well, you can now. And so it is a little bit different than those other guys that you mentioned. And because of that, his average perhaps isn't as good as it should be, but there are other issues that he has as well.
Yeah. I mean, when we're talking about averages, his home average in tests was fantastic, off the charts. If you're playing test cricket in Australia and you are Australia, you're starting with David Warner. It's a shoo-in, right? But he has the fourth lowest away average for openers with over 1,000 runs, which is, well, I mean, considering that he was only a plus batter in South Africa, Bangladesh, and the UAE away from home, that's a bit of a blemish on that batting legacy.
I'd say that's more than a blemish.
Hmm.
Also, the first tour in South Africa where he makes all the runs, I was on that tour. And I don't like focusing too much on players getting dropped a lot, right? Everyone gets dropped and that's fine. But I do remember like AB de Villiers almost getting hit in the face at one stage by a ball that like every other wicketkeeper in the world would have taken. And he had a lot of luck on that tour, came back the next time, didn't do as well. So it's kind of, I'd have to go through the numbers 100%, but my memory is it's one good series in South Africa and then 2 tests in Bangladesh and 2 tests in the UAE. So you could make the claim that outside of one proper tour to South Africa, he really wasn't an away player. And, you know, when we're looking at the great top 50 batters, and we're nitpicking because of the level that he's at, right? Like, you know, once you get to a level of someone as talented as him, you do start to nitpick a little bit because obviously he has lots of great things about his record. But it would be hard to say you could be an all-time great if your away average is 33 in what was, at least for a good part of your career, a very, very good run-scoring era. And then on top of that, you play in Australia, right? You're not playing in South Africa, or you're not playing in India on the recent wickets they've had, or perhaps struggling to score like you can in Bangladesh at times and those sorts of places, or England or New Zealand against a new ball.
Yeah. God forbid you're not English, because he really struggled over there.
Exactly. And so you start to look at that and you just go, wow, he really was probably one of the best home players there has ever been. He might be one of the best batters in Australia that has ever existed, right? But he just is not. And he's not even an above average player away from home. My guess is that his overall record away from home is probably sub average. And and he's not the only player that's out there. I know Michael Clarke had a very interesting record, and Mahela Jayawardene has a very interesting record. We've seen players like this before, but it's a hard thing to ignore, right?
Yeah, Dean Elgar is another one, as we've recently found out.
Yeah.
But Alistair Cook is actually one of Warner's peers who had a lot of overlap with Warner's era. Of course, Cook started earlier and retired early as well. But in comparison, whenever we think about these two, conventional wisdom suggests that Cook is the higher quality opener. Now, Cook was a brilliant player of spin, so he did well in Asia. He was also pretty good against the moving ball, fared well, right? And he played his home cricket in England. And he was a plus batter in all conditions other than New Zealand and South Africa. His era ended before the wobble ball era or the pace playing pandemic started, though, diminishing averages all across the globe, particularly of openers. So how would you rate Cook up against or in comparison to Warner?
They end up with a very similar overall average, but I think the main difference is that you can trust Cook to be good at home and away, and you just can't do that with Warner. The strike rate is where Warner probably catches back up to Cook, obviously. The funny thing is, I think Cook is seen as a defensive batter, but his strike rate's about par. It's about normal. I think his strike rate's at 47, right? He was a good strike rotator, so, he didn't get trapped very often. Yeah. But yeah, the interesting thing is, you said he was a good player of the moving ball, which of course in England he was, but didn't really translate to South Africa or New Zealand as much for Cook. But I just think if you're comparing them, one had to open in a place where it's quite tough to open, and did a really, really sterling job. The other had to open in a place where it is quite easy to open. I think comparatively in Australia, especially if you're an Australian opener, and you're good, which Warner was, it's a good, very good place to open. But Cook was more useful everywhere. I don't think it matters. I think you can make a claim that either one is the best opener of their era. But I don't think you can make a unanimous decision that either one is easily better than the other one. And so, again, you would have to say that Warner is... You've got Rohit and Usman there with the better averages, and you've got Cook with a similar average in tougher conditions, who was more rounded as a player.
More games as well. He played 50 odd more tests than David Warner.
Exactly. And so I think, and probably started. Like we talked about Warner starting when he, when he was learning early on in his career, whereas Cook was actually batting for England when he was, very, very young. So look, I think some of it just comes down to personal preference. I would have Cook slightly higher in Test match cricket, even if I think that Warner might be the harder guy to replicate. Like I think it might be easier to find a Cook than it is a Warner. Although you could argue that it's not particularly easy to find an opener who can make a lot of runs in Asia and also handle the new ball. But either way, the point being is I don't think anyone would be just. It's not easy for anyone to say Warner is the best Test opener of his era, because I just don't think you could make that argument 100%.
Not with that away record for sure. And even Asian tests are a big part for batters who originate from Sena nations. And Cook definitely has the wood over Warner in that regard. Let's jump to ODI cricket, right? Warner had the 5th best batting average and 3rd best strike rate for any opener in his era. But his impact always felt far greater than that. So you'd have to say that Warner in ODI cricket was more than his numbers suggest, especially when you consider World Cup cricket, because his record for Australia in ODI World Cups is exemplary.
So I think his average and his record is almost identical to Quinton de Kock.
Pretty much.
And my memory, not even my memory, but let's be honest, no one really rates him on a similar level to Quinton de Kock, right? Some of that is smaller nation thing, and that can happen. And Quinton de Kock is not the most, doesn't have the biggest public image or anything. Like, he just plays his cricket. He doesn't dance on TikTok or, get involved in Sandpaper Gate. Although he had his own issues with David Warner.
Doesn't take the knee either.
Yeah. Well, I mean, everything that Quinton de Kock has done has been kind of like a private thing, right? Whereas Warner lived very publicly. So they're very different kinds of people. But the truth is that Quinton de Kock, as fantastic as he's been, hasn't won a World Cup, right? He hasn't been a major player who has pushed that forward. And so David Warner is probably seen as vastly a better player than Quinton de Kock. However, overall, there's still Rohit Sharma out there, right? Yeah. And I think that if you were picking an opener for ODI cricket, you'd probably pick Rohit over Warner, unless you wanted a left-hander who ran really fast. And I think, again, you could put Warner in that group, but I don't think he's a standout number one in ODI cricket, as fantastic as he's been. Also, what I really like about him as a one-day player and as a T20 player is the player that we saw against Dale Steyn completely changed. By 2019, when he came back from Sandpaper Gate, he was almost like, it was like an Energizer bunny looking for quick singles and punching the ball through point. Completely different to the guy that would just stand tall and whack you back over your head.
Yeah, no, we'll talk about that evolution later on as well. I want to touch on the IPL now because it's a really important part of Warner's career. He lifted the trophy as captain of Sunrisers Hyderabad, and he has the 3rd best strike rate ever in the IPL, coupled with the 2nd best average ever. So those are like superstar level numbers. And he was also a social media sensation, or that's how he came to become a social media sensation, through his time as leader of Sunrisers Hyderabad before they released him and then blocked him on social media. So that's an interesting story right over there. But he continues to apply his trade. Yeah.
It's a perfect example of that's just not happening to someone else, is it? Do you know what I mean?
Definitely not.
It's that whole thing was so bizarre from beginning to end of just like, that year when he didn't make any runs anyway, I mean, no, you're right. It's just a fantastically weird part of his career, the IPL.
Yeah. The fact that he got blocked now and his mates are getting picked up in the auction by Sunrisers and he can't see those posts, I find that hilarious. But he continues to apply his trade in the IPL, right? He's playing with the Delhi Capitals. He used to be a Delhi player back in the day as well. And he's just been so immense for the tournament overall. Like, when you think of the IPL, David Warner is one of the few foreign players that immediately springs to mind.
Yeah, he's a franchise foreign player, isn't he? In a way that Gale, De Villiers, there aren't that many others, right? Who are just automatic, which is what made him being dropped and losing the captaincy and everything. So bizarre from that point of view. But look, I think with any player who has a career like he has had, I think he will be kept more in the public spotlight and talked about more going forward because of the IPL. Because as the IPL gets bigger, do you know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to think of like Dean Elgar's career and I'm not saying he's on the same level as Warner, but Dean Elgar's career is it's just the tests he's played, right? And and whereas Warner there's so many different facets to it of where it is going to be remembered and how we're going to think about it for a long period of time to come. And the fact that he won an IPL championship is just, another thing that will help him with media careers and everything else down the line. And also kind of future-proof his legacy a little bit.
A lot of people complain that I'm not a former cricketer and so that I don't really know the game. Well, you know what they can't claim? That I don't know desks. I've been using desks for years. I'm a collector of desks, old and new, and I'm sitting on a new one right now. I'm the Don Bradman of sitting at desks. So when I tell you that the E7 Pro next generation height adjustable desk from FlexiSpot is legit, this is like Michael Jordan talking to you about sneakers. This desk holds 160 kilograms. It is as stable as anything I've ever seen, and it has under-desk cable management. But really, the main skill here is that this desk rises and falls at the push of a button, and it moves super quick. And it has so many settings that remember your favorite heights. It really does it all. And I could not recommend the E7 Pro from FlexiSpot anymore, even though I am currently sitting on one of FlexiSpot's BS12 Pro multifunctional, adjustable, upgraded fabric, ergonomic chairs. My butt and computer have never been happier than when using one of FlexiSpot's products. So get over to their page right now for big savings.
Yeah, I mean, the legacy definitely is ongoing because he's still playing T20 internationals and T20s. And, the T20 World Cup of 2021, everyone had written Davey off. He had a very, very poor IPL. And, he struck big for Australia in both the semi-final and the final. Australia went on to win a tournament that no one expected them to. And I think that tournament might just be the best we've ever seen of Davey Warner.
Oh, that's
in
really
terms
interesting.
of winning, because he has scored that triple ton versus Pakistan and scored 100 in a session as well. But then again, that's home cricket, right? This was Asia.
Yeah, and that also goes back to how funny his overseas test record is, because he doesn't have any problems with the white ball when he travels, right? It really is a red ball thing. I think that was a really interesting one. As you said, it's probably put a couple of extra years of IPL on the back end of his career. It's kept him, kept him up there and everything else. And Australia's been such a good team that it's a bit. I always think of Ian Bell in that era when England did really, really well, and Bell was the number 4, number 5. I think number 5. KP was number 4 at that point. And Ian Bell played some really important innings. And in 2013, when we didn't realize that team was as on the slide as it turned out it was, Bell carried them to a home victory by making so many runs against Australia.
Yeah.
You kind of need that one thing. Do you know what I mean? That one moment that is yours. And sadly for Belly, it didn't matter because the next series they got absolutely smashed in the face and everyone forgot. But if they'd managed to draw 13-14, Bell would have got that kind of thing. And I think that's what Warner sort of gets here, right? That one series that is kind of his, right? And no one series is ever one person's, right? But you know what I mean? It came late in his career. I don't think he was as relevant in cricket. It came after the sandpaper incident, after the suspension, all these different things. And then that was an absolute epic series.
Yeah, no, goes without saying, no two ways about it. And, even though he had that T20 World Cup, he won 2 ODI World Cups, Test Championship, even got his fairy tale ending, right? He scored runs in his final knock, a half century, won the Test series for Australia 3-0. It all sounds rosy, but that journey has seen some really troubled periods, right? He was, if you talk about his evolution, he was nicknamed the Bull. Then there was the rebrand to Reverend, which didn't quite work out. I mean, there was the punch to Joe Root that we often forget and didn't even make the piece. So,
oh my God.
Yeah. There's that. And of course, the spat or cussing that took place between him and Quinton de Kock, which went viral right before Sandpaper Gate. Then Sandpaper Gate happens. People are pissed that they haven't heard from Warner yet because Smith's already given a press conference. He does eventually have one. He apologizes. And after, he makes his comeback, we see this, rejuvenation of David Warner. Great comeback story, back to being that social media superstar. And now he's retiring on his own terms, punching Mitch Johnson in the dick. So it's a great arc.
I mean, you missed there was a whole one where he howled like a dog at the South Africans for an entire day as well. Like you could go on and on about the kinds of on-field transgressions, off-field incidences. There is, I know we've mentioned it kind of offhandedly a couple of times, but first cricketer famous on TikTok, is that fair to say?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Married another athlete who was already quite well known as well. I mean, I call her an athlete, but she's kind of like an athlete, entrepreneur, influencer type person as well.
Also, he's developed, or at least for social media and what we see, a big family man. You know, David Warner is all about family now.
Look, I mean, having seen him personally, like very much, a father type person, not a person who has kids. I think that's probably fair to say. And so you have all these different things that have happened to him, and then you add the entertainment on the field and the fact that we got it in all three formats. There is just a fascinating amount of entertainment value, and also Schadenfreude, right? Like he gave us the ability to laugh at him. He gave us the ability to boo him. Right. He was probably at one stage early on his way to being cricket's great hero. Like if you said that you had a guy who's going to be in the argument for, best T20 opener with Chris Gale, best ODI opener with Rohit Sharma, and best test opener with Alistair Cook, and that was going to be one of the fastest scorers ever in ODI, T20, and in Test cricket, who was going to going to be involved in these incredibly famous moments. I mean, we got another one. Phil Hughes's. He was sledging Phil Hughes on the day that Phil Hughes died. Right? Like, there's
I did not know that
much. Yeah, there. He was out on the field when that happened. All these things are just. It just never ended with him, and he could have been the people's champ, right? But he's actually been probably the pantomime villain for a long period of time. And he kind of became that person as well. I mean, that's the one thing that he kind of became cricket's evil king. And you know that I've been mucking around with AI imagery relating to that today. But it is kind of who he became as a cricketer. And it's been a fascinating, weird journey from everything else. From a kid who, we talked about him batting with Eddie Cowan before. Those two came up, similar ages. I think Eddie's a couple of years older, obviously, but similar ages. Eddie goes to arguably one of the best schools in Sydney, and grew up next to movie producers and all that sort of stuff. And Davey's a boy from the block, right? Like he very much a very opposite kind of person. Not that that's a rare thing in Australian cricket or anything else, but he had to fight for everything he got early on. And I think that I would say, if you would ask me what the biggest issue is with him, is I think he thinks he needs to fight. Whereas I think at a certain point, it would have been great if, when he was rebranded as the Reverend, it would have been great if he could have just accepted where he was and accept that sort of stuff. And I'm not sure he always did. And I flashed this up before accidentally when I was trying to find it. But, with some of these cricketers, obviously, when we talk about them, I sometimes have a relationship. With David Warner, it's a little bit different. And I'm going to tell this story. My dad's going to be really upset about this, but that's fine. So I get the job with St. Lucia, and they wanted to hire David Warner. And I said, we've already got 15 openers in a team. We don't need him. By the end of the tournament, he was batting number 4. So I was right there. But it's David Warner and the owner, who I think... and an article about the St. Lucia owner recently went viral, where he's up to 500 lawsuits against him. Anyway... If you want to look up Jay Pandya and Pizza Hut or St. Lucia stars, and if there's any American journalists out there who want to do the big expose, I've got some funny stories. But, he wanted to hang out with David Warner because it's David Warner, right? Like, I get it. And, and I remember the first morning he came up, and I think he knew it was going to be kind of awkward. Him and Kyron Pollard were really, really quite professional about it. Where not all players have been, but they were really quite professional, knowing that I'd written quite a bit about them, and it was awkward for me, and it was awkward for them, right? He came up the first morning he arrived, asked if he could have breakfast with me, and we sat down and we chatted. And when my dad turned up at St. Lucia, my dad was all like, bloody David Warner, I can't believe he's got to work with David Warner and all this sort of stuff. A week into St. Lucia, my dad's like, "Oh, so Davey's just been telling me about this restaurant around the corner." Completely won over by the family, mucking around, like, smiling at their kids and all this sort of stuff. So there is a side to David Warner that I don't always think has come through. And I think that a lot of it is him projecting this kind of image and the tough guy mentality and everything else. But he's not as one-dimensional as he comes across. And, I think he's a thoroughly interesting person in the history of cricket. And if you just want to look at the cricket side of things, he probably is the best all-format opener that we've had. I think Chris Gale's the only other one that's probably on a similar level. And obviously Rohit Sharma, if he would have played more, would have probably gone beyond both of them. Especially in that kind of way. But I'd say that Warner's right there. But I don't think that's the most interesting thing. I think the most interesting thing is that he has been a central part of so many different dramas in his career all the way through. So from that point of view, I find him an absolutely fascinating cricketer. Put to the point of which he announced his retirement, but he didn't retire, Behram. He set it on a stage. I'll be retiring from this, and then on this, and then this. And then, of course, he makes the 100. And this is where it goes back to what I was saying before, is I kind of thought if I made that 100 in my last series with all the pressure and all the talk that was in the media, I would just be happy for myself. Whereas he made it about Mitchell Johnson again. One way or another, David Warner is always a part of the narrative and a part of the story. And I think that is a fascinating career to have had for someone who, at the age of 22, 23, really hadn't played much professional cricket and no one knew was going to go on to have this kind of an impact on our cricket.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a fantastic monologue. And, it's interesting. You mentioned that 100 that he scored at Perth. He shushed Mitch Johnson. So he was really part of that narrative. And he's just been one for theatre, right? Very, very theatrical in whatever way you'd like to call it. But here's a question for you. Now, when you were at St. Lucia and you had David Warner on the team, this was probably in that year where he was banned, right? If I'm not wrong? Yeah,
he had been banned, 6 months before?
I want to ask you that did you see some sort of behavioral discrepancies, some changes from Warner thereon? Because this is what Mitch Johnson was, wasn't happy about, plus the fact that Warner was getting to retire on his own terms. But, people, or even I say often that you can see how Steve Smith is a changed man post Sandpaper Gate. How was David Warner post Sandpaper Gate? You would know really well because you were there with him in the interim where he was banned from international cricket by Cricket Australia.
I think he was maturing and changing as a person anyway. I can't remember how old his kids were, but I know they were slightly younger than mine. Mine would have been around 4 and maybe 4 and 3. And I think he had a couple of daughters. We both added to our families actually since then, but I think he had a couple of kids at that stage and they were a little bit younger. So I think it was at that stage when his life was kind of developing naturally. I don't know if he was, I think it changed him in that at that point, he probably thought to himself I remember I once did this thing where I asked all these different budding sports writers to write an article and send them to me. And someone wrote this article about how Warner was, I think he equated him to the Two-Face character in the Batman trilogy. And was saying that how he could have a redemption arc. And I was like, did Two-Face have a redemption arc? I thought Two-Face just became a villain and stayed as a villain, but maybe I'm misremembering. But I think at that point, what I felt from Warner, and I'm not going to go into private stuff we talked about, but what I felt from Warner was an acceptance of who he was. Right? And if anything, what we saw afterwards, and we're talking about the dad TikTok stuff, right? Is almost, and the jokes on social media, at Sunrise's expense. And was it when he got fired by the Sunrisers, he was in the stands with a Sunrisers flag or something?
Something like that.
I actually think in some ways that was the David Warner that he had hidden a little bit, right? So we saw him as a bullish bore, right? And I think that as he matured, he probably had a little bit more fun with that and also understood that he wasn't really gonna change anyone's opinion. But I don't know if the Sandpaper Gate thing really affected Steve Smith or David Warner all that much.
Hmm.
But it happened to come at a point where both of them were maturing anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And it probably allows you just at that stage, everyone has an opinion on who you are, and you can just be the person you are, right? And I think sometimes that just makes it a lot easier.
I think it's very interesting, the insight that you've provided over here of him accepting who he was, because we saw a lot of brash arrogance in terms of cussing other players, sledging prior to Sandpapergate. Post Sandpapergate, he's had a bit of fun with the opposition as well. We see him with the Pakistan guys. He's doing Shaheen's celebration, Hassan's celebration, Sajid's celebration. He's having fun with the crowd. That's a different side of David Warner that we saw. And maybe the whole social media element of that gave steam to that personality, but he's definitely ended his career as more of a loving character that he was before, because he definitely roughed some people up the wrong way pre-Sandpapergate. Now, time to answer the burning question of whether or not David Warner is an all-format GOAT. You've, of course, said that he is, and I mean, he's Australia's highest century maker opener. No other opener has scored more centuries than David Warner across formats. And he's also the second highest run scorer for Australia across formats, only behind punter. That's elite company. Or, well, out of all the great Australian batters that we've seen, and we've seen many, for him to have the second most runs across formats, that says something. Third quickest opener in Test cricket, second best opener in the last 3 ODI World Cups, second only to maybe Rohit Sharma, and maybe a bit higher than Quinton de Kock if you look at winning trophies and impact. Also, one of the best ever IPL batters of all time. I think he makes the cut. He is the all-format, well, maybe not GOAT, but second best.
I think Kohli's probably the all-format, and Kohli and De Villiers are probably the all-format guys, right?
Those are the guys I was thinking about.
But as an opener, he's probably, Rohit and Gale are not far off, but, I think he has pretty strong cases against both of those guys. But that is where his legacy is. I don't think his legacy is. I don't think he's going to be remembered as better than Gale. Him and Cook maybe neck and neck, and then Rohit has probably gone beyond him. So his legacy really is the fact that he did it all. And if you want to, we talk about all three formats, but IPL is almost a separate format, right?
Yeah.
I know it's not fair to the Pakistani players who aren't there, but it's almost a separate, level. There's been a lot of good players. Like Quinton de Kock is a serviceable IPL player.
Yeah.
Right? There's nothing wrong with him as an IPL player, and he's played in some very good teams. But he's not David Warner. Like, he hasn't had the impact of David Warner. And so, again, you start to focus on that, and you do realize just how much David Warner did.
In comparison to Rohit, I think I would take Warner in Senna as a test. Well, not England. So, some countries in Test cricket, some countries I take Rohit. In T20s, I'd probably always take David Warner, and in ODIs, I'd always take Rohit Sharma. So it's close over there. It's not like Rohit is above him by an awful lot. But you mentioned him as being an entertainer. I think that really seals that legacy, right? If you were watching David Warner bat or play cricket in any sort of capacity, one thing for sure is that you were entertained.
Yeah, and I think on and off the field, right? Like, that's what I was saying before. There was just a lot of drama in David Warner, and and the way that his career has ultimately panned out. And he's probably not an all-time great red ball player. He probably is an all-time great white ball player across both formats, as we talked about before. But his real impact is that the fact that we've been talking about David Warner for I don't know, when did he hit the Dale Steyn? Was it 2008, 2009?
Yeah.
We've been talking about him for a very, very long time. And he's had, I think, a cultural impact. He's had an impact beyond cricket. I remember, actually, I was talking to ESPN.com. So they, I think I was after I left Cricinfo. ESPN.com tried to recruit me to write feature pieces. And she was asking me all the different things that I had ideas for features, and we were going through them. And then one of them was, and I said, well, I'm actually about to go work with David Warner in St. Lucia. And this is like an American person who didn't know. And she goes, is that the guy with the, and I said, are you going to talk about sandpaper? She goes, yeah, the sandpaper guy. And you realize that, like, a couple of times, like, we're talking about someone who had a cultural impact, across things here. So I think he's an absolutely fascinating person on and off the field. And we've done essentially a podcast on him on the field.
Yeah.
We could go back from beginning to end and go off the field. Like, the fact that let's take it back to, I think I mentioned this at the top, the double-sided bat, right? That angered former cricketers so much, right? That he was coming through with this. Like, he's been controversial from the get-go all the way through. And I suppose couldn't have had a better Yoda-like figure than for him to say Wag kind of helping him out, right? Like what a couple of abs, sometimes misfits just find each other, right? And it's hilarious of all the teams. What happens if Warner doesn't end up at Delhi?
Yeah.
Right?
Maybe he doesn't play Test cricket till later.
And maybe he still does. I don't know. But it feels like that was the right person at the right time. Because of all the people in the world, who else? It would have only been Gordon Greenidge or Matt Hayden who he would have listened to at that level, right? To suddenly have someone who was so similar to you just go, no, mate, you're not just a T20 player. You could play any format is an incredible thing.
Yeah, that's a solid endorsement. And like Viru himself was someone who changed Test cricket, opening the batting. So to transfer that to Warner, that's a great story. Also, top 3 mustaches in Australian cricket, I'd say Merv Hughes, Travis Head, Davey Warner. Is that fair?
You've got to do some history.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, that's a very modern list. And
does he make your top 10? Does he make your top 10?
I mean, there's some rippers back in the 1800s, mate, as well. I mean, you didn't. I don't want you to get killed on the internet, but you didn't mention David Boone.
I didn't.
Which I don't know if I would have David Warner's mustache in a top 10 list of even David Warners who have had mustaches, let alone him himself. But look, he had one, and good for him.
Yeah, I mean, Mitch Johnson's also there with the handlebars, so maybe I did misspeak over there. And maybe there's a Crick Picks podcast in this, right? You mentioned it.
There is, and we have to remember that, by the way, because I once ranked the best mustaches in cricket, and it really annoyed people, so we have to do that.
Definitely doing that. And you spoke of his off-field stuff, right? I would love to talk about David Warner's evolution as a human being with someone like Usman Khwaja. They've been mates since the early days. You saw Warner sharing a very, heartwarming hug with Usman's mother. And it's interesting how both of those guys are outspoken in their own way, but yet so different. And they just love each other to the end of times.
Yeah, I think politically they're very different. Culturally they're very different, but they obviously have a very strong relationship. And I think they certainly both know what it's like to go through the full ringer of the international cricketer experience. I know we talked about him on the Uncovered podcast, but like someone like Asad Shafiq, how many test matches would he have played? 60 or 70 test matches?
77, I think.
It feels like, and this is not a slight on him, but it feels like he had very little impact on the game and didn't really go through the emotional trouble that some other cricketers have to go through, right? Like some people get that sort of supporting role career, and there are other people around that we talk about. And even when they're under pressure, but it's very rarely the major news point, right? Whereas I think Usman Khawaja and David Warner have probably gone through kind of a lot together. And as I said before, you mature and you're a different person. I think we do this thing. Jeff Lemon wrote this really interesting piece, I want to say during the 2019 Ashes, when Steve Smith made 100 and everyone started hailing it as the great comeback 100. Oh, incredible. And Jeff Lemon's like, well, he was good at cricket before. He's played a lot of professional cricket in between, and he's good at cricket again, right? We are looking for that narrative of it's changed him, right? And realistically, if you look at David Warner, when we first saw him back in that T20 against South Africa, through to now, like, it's not sandpaper that's changed him. It's everything that's changed him. And the things that have kept him the same are probably the reasons we're still talking about him today. And the fact that he might still play Champions Trophy again. And he might not. He's not even actually technically retired. He's still got. He's still semi-active in ODI cricket. He's still playing domestic T20 cricket, and he might play in the Champions Trophy. So it will go on, right? There'll be another former player who'll be really upset. Well, what do you mean he's got to come back for the Champions Trophy? Like it will never end.
Yeah, and he'll be a platinum pick in all the leagues going around the circuit for at least a couple of years, because who wouldn't want a David Warner in their team, right? Jarrod, are you familiar with the David and Goliath story?
I believe it was a small person who threw rocks at a big clay person.
So it's actually interesting. I was listening to a podcast of Malcolm Gladwell go over the story, and it's always we're made to believe that, David had no chances. He was tiny. Goliath was a giant or whatever, and he was never supposed to win. Well, Goliath was actually a giant, right? According to Malcolm Gladwell, he was suffering from giantism and they just didn't know what that was back in the day. And David was an archer and he had the agility. So David actually was the favorite to win that fight, but they didn't have the acumen to judge that. I think the title of this podcast, and I just thought of this now, David, the all format Goliath, works really well with Warner because he is that beastly figure, but he is intelligent. He's smart. He'll get you. You drop the ball for a second and David Warner is on top of you.
You talked about, let's finish off with this. You talked about his fielding earlier on.
Yeah.
I never thought he was as good a fielder as everyone else did. I think he fumbles a little bit. He's not as quick in the field as we've seen from him in the middle. I don't think he has some of the other instincts. He was never a great fielder in any position, right? So he fielded at mid-off a lot. That's kind of where you don't always put your great fielders. But he always had an impact. And it's because of what you just said then, which is he was always waiting for your moment of weakness.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And if you think about his entire career, that's essentially what he's been doing.
Yeah.
He'll do it with running between wickets. He'll do it with fielding. He'll do it with punching the ball through the field, or he'll do it with slogging across the line. Whatever he has to do, reverse sweep, switch hits, everything, he will do when he wants to do it. And I think that is really a good way of explaining who he was as a professional athlete.
Yeah, and he'll definitely be missed. I mean, cricket's not going to be the same with all these retirements that are happening, of late. And I hope that we get to see the Warner 100 celebration in T20 cricket a lot more times than, we think we will. And he is an iconic cultural icon in many ways. And he's tormented opposition left, right and center, particularly Pakistan. So if that Champions Trophy actually happens in Pakistan, Jarrod, get him on that plane. Just do it. He'll feed off of that energy and he'll be man of the tournament or player of the tournament. But anyway, I think this is where we should end this podcast. So for every one of you who enjoyed it, please like this video, share our content, subscribe to both this channel and Jarrod's other channel. And we'll be back with Footmarks episode 35 next week. That's all for now. Goodbye.
Thanks to the kind folks at FlexiSpot for looking after my office and my butt by sending me their E7 Pro desk that save your favorite desk heights at a touch of a button. You don't have to crank anything. This thing just finds the height that you like and you can work. And their BS12 Pro chair that supports my posterior while I'm recording, this ad and all my shows. If you need great desks, especially ones that change heights or the best quality chairs, head on over to FlexiSpot today.